Alright, so for today's episode, I'm going to be talking about how to find good mule deer units. And what I mean by good mule deer units is units with higher population. So what I did is I have two examples. I have an Idaho example, where I'm going through units that have higher mule deer harvests versus higher whitetail harvests. So I go through the harvest stats for those units and see what percentage whitetail versus mule deer, and then I kind of explain why you might see that difference, in particular in Idaho. So the example of where you're hunting a state that has both whitetails and mule deer, and you're trying to figure out, okay, if I'm targeting mule deer, what part of this state would I want to hunt, versus if I want to avoid whitetails, what part of the state would I want to avoid? So I give that kind of example, and then I give the example of two different unit areas in Nevada, one that's a low population unit and one that's a high population unit, and then why you see the population difference between those two units. So I want to give these examples so that maybe you're not doing Idaho, or maybe it's not Nevada, maybe it's Montana, and you're trying to find which area would have more mule deer versus whitetails. Or if you're looking at Wyoming or Colorado in an area that's all mule deer anyway, and you want to maybe be able to look at a map and determine, okay, is there going to be more mule deer in this area, or is this going to be a relatively low population area? So that's what today's episode covers. I've got enough harvest stats in this episode. It's doing the kind of thing I want to do with this, which is publish harvest stats and give you guys actual concrete information to look at to back up what I'm claiming. So this episode does have a lot of population and harvest stats, or at least enough of them to back up what I'm saying. But here is the episode on how to find good mule deer areas, or look at mule deer versus whitetail areas. Alright, so first we're going to talk about Idaho. So what I did was I selected three different big game hunting units in Idaho. So I chose Unit 27 down in kind of the central portion of the state right about here. Unit 17, more northernly than 27, right on the border with Montana. And then Unit 10 from in the southern portion of the higher part of the panhandle. So the reason I chose these three different units for Idaho is they all have very different harvest statistics for deer. So to start with, Unit 27, the harvest statistic that I wanted to look at was 2% of the deer in this unit were whitetail deer. And that's what we're going to be looking at when we focus on this Idaho stuff, is the mule deer to Idaho ratio. So as we go through, we're going to hopefully be able to kind of point you in the right direction, so you're going to be able to decide just based on, you can look at the units and you can scout and figure this out quickly, or you could do what I did and look at the harvest stats. But there's indicators so that you can look at a unit, and based on its terrain and plant features and stuff like that, you'll be able to see what type of deer you're going to be able to pull out of those units more, whether it's going to be more of a whitetail deer dominated unit or a mule deer dominated unit. So for Unit 27, only 2% of the deer harvested here were whitetails. For Unit 17, that number goes up to 50% whitetails. And then for Unit 10, that's our most northerly unit in Idaho, 94% of the deer harvested in this unit were whitetails. So the numbers that I got for these percentages too were the kind of the 3-year average from the last 3 years of their harvest. I think Unit 27 has had some years where they haven't pulled any whitetails out of it. And then Unit 17 can fluctuate. I see some years where it's only 30% whitetail, some years where it's just over 50, approaching 60% whitetail. But these are kind of the 3-year average for each unit. So what causes this sort of thing? So the main thing that sticks out is, from my kind of poor representation and poor graphic, but once again, I don't want to do any copyright infringement on Google Earth or Google Maps, so I've decided to just create these graphics myself. If you look at the terrain, most of what you're going to see in Unit 27 is pretty open country. You see a lot of drier terrain like this, especially on the south side of these slopes. You're going to get pretty open country, not a lot of trees there, and it's going to be mixed in with a lot of different sagebrush and stuff like that. And then this white here represents the really higher spines of these various mountain ranges, because in Idaho, once you get up into central Idaho, it's not distinctive mountain ranges like you would get in Nevada, where they're all running north to south, perpendicular, or parallel, rather, mountain ranges. You get a lot of different spines going in many different directions. So where each one spines out, you kind of get this If you look at it on Google Earth, you'll know exactly what I mean. You see white on the spines and then brown on some of the lower spines. And then you'll see green in all the drainages and stuff like that. And then that's representative where there's more sagebrush and different kinds of mountain brush, maybe choke cherries, bitter brush, that sort of mountain brush community. And then there is some timber within these units too. It's not entirely free of timber. You do see some, I'm guessing they're white pines in Nevada. It would be a lot of white pines. I'm not sure about Idaho. Maybe it's ponderosa pine or maybe even spruce up there. But you do see pines in areas that get more water. So that's probably more the drainages and a little bit of the higher portion north-facing slopes. You'll see some timber. But for the most part, Unit 27 is very open. Moving into Unit 17. Oh, the other thing I want to hit up with Unit 27 that's really important before I leave is the elevation in Unit 27 on average is between 8,500 and 9,500 feet in elevation. So this is 8,500 to 9,500 feet in elevation. Whereas the next unit we're going to look at, Unit 17, which is 50-50 whitetail to mule deer. And all these units, by the way, they harvested over 100 deer in each of these units, so it's not skewed really heavy one way because there's a low harvest statistic. These are all high harvest units. But Unit 17 is 50-50. Why is that? So Unit 17, the elevation goes down to on average between 7,300 to 8,300 feet. So you're dropping down 1,000 feet in elevation. And what you see here is the spine between Washington and Idaho. Since it's more northerly, you get a lot more of exposed limestone outcroppings. That's this. So this entire area is kind of if you were in California in the Sierras, they would call it the granite zone, where it's completely devoid of vegetation. And this is the spine right between Idaho and Montana. So this is pretty much devoid of all vegetation. And then down in those drainages, you get a lot of big timber, a lot of evergreen trees, really old. I wouldn't say older growth in the sense of Pacific West Coast old growth, but this is older growth evergreen timber through the center part of this unit. And then when you kind of get on to the west side of this unit here, that's where you get into more terrain like this, where it opens up again, and then you get into sagebrush, more open mountain brush communities. So the more open terrain is favoring mule deer, whereas this more dense evergreen terrain is favoring the whitetail. So that's why you see a 50% ratio for this unit. It's actually really easy to pick out once you know what you're looking for. You see more open terrain in Idaho, which is especially kind of this portion right here is most of your open terrain in Idaho, and then obviously the southern portion. There's a lot of agriculture land in here. So mainly focusing up here, where it's open terrain here, this is where you get your core mule deer harvest area. And as you go more north in Idaho, you see more whitetail harvest. So then going even further north into Unit 10, 94% of the harvest is whitetail here. And you can see why here. This unit wouldn't look out of place if you picked it up and dropped it into some place like West Virginia or Kentucky, because this elevation is the lowest of all. This is 5,300 to 6,300 feet in elevation. So like I said, there's higher mountains in New Hampshire than there are here. You get very little areas like these tiny little portions that are above timberline here that are completely open, but for the most part, this is going to be pretty dense timber throughout this unit, pretty mature stands of evergreen. Very little open sagebrush and mountain brush communities, but this is more dense timber, which is why it so heavily favors the whitetail, and it's less severe changes in elevation. So mule deer thrive on areas that are rugged and remote, and then they embark on really pretty distant migrations between their summer range and their winter range, whereas whitetails are pretty sedentary overall species, at least in areas where you see them out east. And I'm guessing in this panhandle area of Idaho, it's pretty much the same, because you're not going to get a lot of difference once you get in the Idaho panhandle. You're not going to get much below maybe 4,000 feet. So this 5,300 to 6,300 feet is pretty much going to be where they're most comfortable at, and there's not a whole lot they can do to move out of this elevation range. So they're going to stick to the dense timber like that. But that's pretty much the breakdown of Idaho. So if you were to scout Idaho for a zone, depending on what kind of terrain and especially these plant features you see. So the elevation is important because the elevation kind of determines what the forest features are going to be. But once you know what forest features you're looking for to determine what percent of the harvest is going to be one deer or another, then you'd be able to just look at a map, say a satellite image of Idaho, and say, okay, judging by what we're seeing here, there's a lot of dense timber. This is a really thick evergreen unit, probably whitetail. Whereas you get into an area that would look more like this, very open country unit with more sage basins and maybe isolated pockets of aspens and mountain mahoganies, bitterbrush, that sort of thing, you're getting into more of your mule deer units. And then you see units like Unit 17 where it looks half and half and the harvest is half and half. So that's very indicative. But this is basically the overall what you're going to see in Idaho. But from there I'm going to jump into an example on Nevada because I wanted to take it a different direction here. I didn't just want to show whitetails versus mule deer. I also wanted to be able to show a really high population mule deer unit versus a lower population mule deer unit and what that can look like. So I'm going to jump into Nevada and show a good Nevada example of that. Alright, so this is my Nevada example that I chose. So I chose units 172 and 173. So 172 would be this unit here, the Shoshone Mountains, and then 173 is this area here, the Toyabe Range. And then I chose the Ruby Mountains up by Elko, Nevada. So if you wanted to, I would say after you watch this video, go and find these areas on Google Earth. They're pretty easy to find. So if you want to find this area, Austin, the town of Austin, would be up here on Highway 50. So find Austin, and then look on the mountain range that's directly south of there. That's the Toyabe Range. And then to find this range, the Ruby Mountains, it sticks out like a sore thumb if you're looking at Nevada. But Spring Creek is right about here, and then Elko's a little further off on Highway 80 about here. But that's how you'd find the Ruby Mountains, and that's how you'd find the Toyabe Range, by looking for Austin and Elko and Spring Creek. But like I said, Unit 172 is right here, Shoshones, 73, Toyabes, and then this is the Ruby Mountains, 101 through 103. So let's write down their population estimates that Nevada Department of Wildlife has for these units. So for 172 and 73, they also include 171 of this, but the reason I did this is because most of the deer are in 72 and 73. The population estimate for this range is 3,700 deer. Alright, and for this one, their population estimate is for 101 through 108, but once again, most of the deer are in 101 through 103, so that's the ones I've chosen to illustrate. But the population estimate for that zone is 14,000. Yeah, it's 14,000 flat. So the funny thing about this area is this is over 10% of Nevada's entire mule deer population, usually centered around migrating to and from the Ruby Mountains into the surrounding ranges. Why is this? So there's a couple different things that stick out. Is if you look at it latitude-wise, 172, 173, this area around the Toyabes, is in kind of the central portion of the state, whereas the Ruby Mountains are in the far northeastern corner of the state. What does that do for the terrain there? Well, the Ruby Mountains get a lot more snow, and they hang on to that snow for much longer throughout the year. So they actually have much more moisture, and they have a different sort of terrain. So the snow keeps different kinds of timber from encroaching into that area, especially pinyon junipers. So they have more open country and more diverse plant communities up high because the pinyon junipers aren't encroaching into it, because they have that snow for longer. And like I said, it doubles because they have moisture for longer in this zone. Whereas this zone being in the central portion of the state, it still gets a decent amount of snow, but it doesn't get as much as this one up here. So what you see with this unit is there's kind of a belt of pinyon junipers around it. So I'll insert a picture here of what I mean of a different mountain range, but you see this belt of dark green here, and this is sort of the belt of pinyon junipers that goes from about, we'll say 6,000 up to just about 8,000 feet in elevation. Once you get above that into the center, the spine of this mountain range, you're into sagebrush basins. There'll be isolated patches of aspens and some bitterbrush here. But you have to get above this pinyon juniper belt. Whereas the belt around this area isn't as big because it's getting more snow, and this is more dominated by aspens and different kinds of timber like white pines versus just sheely pinyon junipers here. Now, the thing about that too is white pines let in a little bit more, not necessarily more light, but they take up less of the moisture too. Pinyon junipers are really big water hogs, so there can be more diverse plant communities based on the types of pines that are going to make up the timber here. And the rubies are known for their really diverse plant communities, whereas here in the Toyabe range, most of what you're seeing above the pinyon juniper belt is going to be just strict sage basins And then some slopes will have little drainages of aspens, but that's just about 90% of it. You'll be lucky to find a patch of mountain mahoganies or bitterbrush in this zone. Whereas this area in the Ruby Mountains, due to its different weather patterns, like I said, with it getting more snow and different kinds of soils, it has a very diverse mountain community. You'll see different kinds of choke cherries through there. You'll see a lot more bitterbrush. You'll see a lot more mountain mahoganies, a lot more aspen trees. You'll still see sagebrush, and then you'll see a lot of different types of low-growing flowering plants. Really small stuff like clover-looking type stuff growing throughout the rubies. Just very diverse plant communities in the rubies. And that's due to the amount of moisture they get. And the other thing I'm going to talk about here is soil type. So central Nevada, the soil types is built off of volcanic soils, versus a lot of the northeastern and the far east side of Nevada, this is all limestone soils. So it's conducive to growing a different sort of plant, actually. It's a different acidity entirely. And the central portion, in addition to that, is much drier. So if you look at the dead center portion of Nevada, like the Toyobe Range, this one I'm illustrating here, the Tokima Range, the Monitor Range, the Desatoya Range, all of those ranges are drier ranges. Whereas if you get onto the east side of Nevada, ranges like the Ruby Mountains, the Shell Creek Range. I don't hunt the east side a lot. I actually tend to prefer the central side. Let me think here. What else do we have on the east side, man? Mainly the Shell Creek, the Ruby Mountains, and then Current Mountain, the area around that. But if you look on the east side of Nevada, you'll see a lot more of these rugged limestone spine units with actual white pines and the traditional pine tree timber stuff, because it's a different kind of soil. They get more moisture and they can grow different kinds of plants. So the east side of Nevada has less of a rain shadow effect that the central portion of Nevada has. The central portion of Nevada still suffers a lot from the rain shadow of the Sierras, just because it's that much closer to the Sierras, and just due to how high the Sierras are. The Sierras have a lot of really high mountain peaks, up to 14,000 feet. So the rain shadow over central Nevada in these ranges is still pretty severe. So there's a huge difference in the amount of moisture that each of these ranges get. There's a difference in the type of soil they have. And then there's a big difference in how much snowfall these two ranges get and how long that snowfall will stay through the summer in. Whereas you lose a lot of the snowfall this last year, 2020, most of the snow was out of the Toyobes by the time end of May. Whereas the Ruby Mountains held onto their snowfall until probably early July was when a lot of it was noticeably melting off. So they have an extra 2 months of snowfall and that much more moisture in that mountain range. Exhibit 2 is the elevation that these ranges are at. So the entire spine of this mountain range is pretty high up. This entire spine runs at about 10,000 feet, which contributes to that snowfall. Not only is it more northern than this range, but it's a little bit higher elevation throughout the entire spine, whereas the high point within the Toyobe Range, the Arc Dome, is just about 11,800 feet, and that's very high. It actually might rival or exceed the highest point in the Ruby Mountains, but as a whole, I think the entire spine of the Ruby Mountains averages a higher elevation than the entire spine of the Toyobe Range. So because of that too, that helps it retain a lot of that snow. But that's what can make or break, in Nevada at least, the difference between a mediocre population of mule deer versus a really good population of mule deer. A lot of it revolves around the water, and then from there you'll get different types of plant communities, and the weather patterns can influence that based on how much snowpack they're going to get. So snowpack and moisture are going to do a lot for a mountain range in a state as dry as Nevada. The other thing is you can take this little lesson and you can actually, if you look at the Ruby Mountains, and then if you scroll over to a state like Colorado, you'll see that Colorado overall has a very similar build to the Ruby Mountains. Whereas if you look at the Toyobe Range, it doesn't necessarily mirror a lot of the habitat in Colorado, whereas a lot of the habitat in Colorado looks a lot like, at least plant community-wise, what you would see in the Ruby Mountains. So that's why Colorado has somewhere 400,000 plus mule deer versus Nevada just under 100,000, because a lot of these ranges like the Toyobe Range in Nevada just aren't as good as a lot of these ranges, and this is pretty much all of Colorado would be in the same kind of tier as the Ruby Mountains habitat-wise. So that's my kind of final example for you guys. So this is what I would use and look at to pick and choose between different mule deer units. Once you've isolated, like the first example, and you're not looking mule deer versus whitetail anymore. Now you're just trying to look and eyeball and see which unit might have more mule deer. This is something that you can kind of intuitively use to try and find out that information. And then from there you can always try and find if the state runs population estimates. This is the actual data I pulled from the population estimates, but this is just kind of my illustration and explanation for why that population estimate might be different. So if you ever can't find those population estimate data, you'd be able to look yourself and you'd be able to kind of eyeball it based on maybe the moisture that unit's getting or the amount of snowpack. But once again, thanks for being here, guys, and let me know if you have any questions down in the comments.